Tulsa King Season 3 Episode 3 isn't playing around. The trailer makes one thing clear: Dwight's so-called empire is bleeding from every angle. And the wolves aren't waiting politely at the door anymore. They're already inside, circling, and ready to take chunks out of what's left of his pride. This isn't just another mob story beat. This is Sheridan pushing Dwight into the ugliest version of survival, where every deal smells like betrayal, every ally looks like a traitor, and every move feels like it might be his last. The real question isn't if Dwight can win. It's if there's even a fight left in him to swing. So, let's break it down. Tulsa King has always thrived on Dwight strutting like he's still untouchable. But Episode 3 is cutting through that swagger with a rusty blade. The hook of this season isn't about watching him build, it's about watching him claw, scratch, and choke his way just to hold onto scraps of control. And the teaser for Episode 3 is practically screaming that Dwight Monfreddy is running out of ground. For 2 seasons, he's been the man who could turn chaos into an advantage. The ex-con who walked into Tulsa like it was his playground and bent the city into his story. But Episode 3? That swagger's cracking, and what slips out underneath isn't power. It's desperation. The most obvious knife in his side right now is Musso. Let's not sugarcoat it. Dwight being forced into this humiliating dance with a Fed is the biggest insult Sheridan could have scripted. And what makes it sting even more is how exposed Dwight looks in this role. He isn't the puppet master anymore. He's the damn puppet. Strings yanked tight by a smirking agent who knows just how far he can pull before Dwight snaps. The teaser paints that tension clear as daylight. Dwight can bark all the orders he wants, puff his cigars like he's still the king of Tulsa, but deep down he knows he's on a leash. And the moment he tugs too hard, the leash tightens, cutting off everything he's been trying to protect. That's not just drama, it's humiliation. And humiliation eats Dwight alive faster than bullets ever could. But here's the kicker: the feds aren't his only nightmare. Episode 3 teases that Dwight's shiny new distillery, the same business he thought would make him look legitimate, is now painted with a giant target. His ego told him bourbon was the next big move, the path to a crown that didn't drip blood. But reality? That distillery is less a fresh start and more a neon sign flashing, "Come burn me down." And right on cue, Jeremiah Dunmire steps out of the shadows. Sheridan didn't bring in Robert Patrick just to fill space. He brought him in to rewrite the power map. Dunmire isn't Chicky's chaos or Waltrip's brute force. He's something colder, older, and meaner. The kind of enemy who doesn't need to scream or swing wild. He just smirks, lets you hang yourself, and then erases you clean from the board. And Dwight, stubborn as ever, is walking straight into his trap thinking he's 2 steps ahead. And if the distillery mess wasn't enough, Dwight's crew is shaking like a house of cards in a tornado. Loyalty in Tulsa has always been shaky. But now it looks like the glue holding his so-called family together is snapping. Bodie, the once eager sidekick, is unraveling. His paranoia bleeding through every glance and every mistake. Mitch looks like he's tired of being dragged into Dwight's ego trips. Cleo's loyalty feels transactional at best. And what does Dwight do? The same thing he always does: pretends control is absolute while doubting everyone in the room. That's the brilliance of Sheridan's setup here. The real enemy isn't Musso or Dunmire. It's Dwight's own paranoia poisoning his crew from the inside. Because if you're running an army where no one believes you'd protect them when the heat comes down, then you're not leading a crew. You're babysitting deserters waiting for the right moment to cut loose. What makes all this even darker is the fallout Sheridan plants at Dwight's feet. Theo's ashes are still fresh, a brutal reminder that Dwight's master plans have collateral. And innocent allies always pay the highest price. The teaser practically rubs Dwight's face in it. Theo burned because Dwight thought bourbon was a safe move. And while Dwight may never admit guilt, the stain is there. Every ally left standing sees it too. Stand too close to Dwight Monfreddy and you risk being the next one buried under rubble. And that kind of reputation spreads faster than any federal file or rival rumor. Episode 3 isn't showing us Dwight as the general of Tulsa. It's showing us Dwight as a man drowning in his own hubris. Musso's leash. Dunmire's shadow. A crew cracking apart. Innocence torched in the crossfire. And through it all, Dwight still tries to act like he's in control. Like one more scheme will save him. But that's the tragic irony Sheridan's selling us. Dwight doesn't need another scheme. He needs to face the truth: his empire was never real, just smoke, mirrors, and ego. And now that smoke is choking him. So here's the real suspense. Episode 3 isn't about whether Dwight can win. It's about how ugly his losing is going to look. Because when the cracks finally split wide open, when the wolves stop circling and start biting, the so-called Tulsa King won't go down like a legend. He'll go down like a man who mistook chaos for control and got swallowed whole. If Section 1 showed us Dwight's empire bleeding out, then Section 2 is where we dig into the infection, the slow rot. that Sheridan is practically daring us to watch spread. Because here's the thing about Dwight Monfreddy, he's always been a man built on control. Control of his crew, control of his story, control of how people see him. He walks into a room, calls himself the general, and expects everyone to salute like he's untouchable. But episode 3 is stripping that illusion down piece by piece. And what's left underneath isn't a king, it's a man scrambling, grasping, and losing faster than he can spin the narrative. Sheridan isn't writing a mob story here. He's writing a slow-motion implosion. And we're watching Dwight's pride light the fuse. First, let's talk about Musso. Because if there's one character designed to peel Dwight apart from the inside, it's him. Dwight hates snitchies, hates leashes, hates the very idea that his survival is tied to someone else's authority. Yet here he is, saddled to a federal handler who knows exactly how much Dwight resents him and relishes every second of it. That dynamic isn't just frustrating Dwight, it's eating him alive. Musso doesn't need to throw punches or threaten violence. His weapon is humiliation. The way the trailer frames it, Musso stands there calm, smug, steady, while Dwight simmers on the edge of eruption. And that's the point. Dwight's whole empire was built on people believing he was always in charge. But with Musso, every look, every smirk, every forced partnership shows Dwight isn't steering anymore, he's being steered. And the deeper that digs, the more reckless Dwight is bound to become. Because Dwight isn't going to play model informant. He's going to lash out. And Sheridan's practically promising us that when that happens, it won't be Musso who pays the price. It'll be Dwight, his crew, and everyone unlucky enough to stand too close. Now layer Dunmire onto this mess. Robert Patrick sliding into the season as Jeremiah Dunmire is the kind of casting move that feels like a declaration. You thought Dwight had tough enemies before? You haven't seen Ruthless yet. Dunmire isn't messy like Chicky or hot-headed like Waltrip. He's the worst kind of rival, a patient predator. The kind of man who doesn't need to storm in guns blazing because he already owns the board you're standing on. Sheridan makes that clear in the teaser. Dunmire doesn't posture, he doesn't bluff, he doesn't even raise his voice. He doesn't have to. His presence alone says it. You're already finished, I'm just deciding how fast. And that makes him terrifying. Because Dwight, for all his bluster, feeds off chaos. He wins when his enemies overplay their hand, when they're too angry or too sloppy to see his angles. But Dunmire? He's not going to slip. He's going to let Dwight hang himself with his own ego. And watching Dwight step into that trap, thinking bourbon and bravado are enough to match generational power, is the exact kind of tragedy this show thrives on. But here's where things get really dangerous. Dwight's own crew doesn't look like they're riding for him the way they used to. Bodhi's paranoia is practically screaming from the trailer. The guy shifting from wide-eyed loyalty to ticking time bomb. Mitch, the barroom sage, is worn thin, pulled into Dwight's chaos but clearly questioning whether it's worth the fallout. And Cleo, let's be honest, her loyalty's about as deep as the profit margin. That's Sheridan's brutal twist here. Dwight might be gearing up for war against Musso and Dunmire, but the people standing next to him don't look ready to bleed for him. And in mob stories, that's not just bad news, it's fatal. Because enemies outside the gates you can prepare for. Enemies at your table? You don't see the knife until it's already in your back. What's fascinating here is how Sheridan is using Dwight's paranoia as both his shield and his downfall. Dwight demands loyalty but trusts no one. He preaches unity but plants suspicion in every corner. The teaser practically taunts us with it. Dwight glaring at his crew, Dwight barking orders, Dwight puffing his chest like he's got it under control while behind him the cracks are spreading. That's the genius of Sheridan's writing. The real implosion isn't going to come from the feds or from Dunmire storming his distillery. It's going to come from someone close deciding Dwight's not worth the risk anymore. And when that happens, it won't feel like betrayal. It'll feel inevitable. Now, let's not forget the collateral damage that's already stacked against him. Theo's ashes still linger over this season like a ghost. And make no mistake, Sheridan wants us to see Theo's ruin as Dwight's responsibility, whether Dwight admits it or not. Because Dwight didn't just make a bad business move. He made a move that lit Theo's life on fire, literally. And now, every ally left is carrying that silent warning, stick with Dwight and you might end up just like Theo, burned, broken, and forgotten. That kind of guilt doesn't fade. It festers. And even if Dwight never shows it on his face, the trailer makes it clear the weight is there. That guilt is going to drive his decisions, twist his judgment, and make him even more unpredictable. The irony is brutal. Dwight built his whole myth around being untouchable. The man who walked out of prison, took over Tulsa, and couldn't be broken. But episode 3 shows us the cracks aren't just showing, they're splitting wide open. Musso pulling strings. Dunmire circling with quiet menace. A crew already half gone. Innocent allies burned in the fallout. And through it all, Dwight's still puffing his chest like it's business as usual. That's not the portrait of a king. That's the portrait of a man clinging to a crown that was never his to begin with. And that's where the tension of episode 3 really sharpens. Not in whether Dwight can outmaneuver his enemies, but in how Sheridan's going to strip him bare in the process. Because Dwight's downfall isn't going to be a single gunshot or a bloody ambush. It's going to be a slow humiliation, a suffocating unraveling, where every illusion of control gets peeled away until he's left with nothing but the truth. He's spent his whole life avoiding. He's not a king. He's a man who mistook fear for loyalty and chaos for power. And episode 3 is daring us to watch how ugly that realization is going to look. If the last section was about Dwight's enemies circling, then section 3 is about the storm closing in, and no matter how much swagger Dwight throws around, you can feel he's running out of shelter. The episode 3 teaser doesn't just drop hints of conflict. It practically screams that every decision Dwight makes now carries the weight of a death sentence. That's what separates this chapter of Tulsa King from the swagger of earlier seasons. Back then, Dwight had room to improvise, room to pull off a wild scheme, flip the board, and walk away with his ego intact. Now, every move feels like the wrong one. Every gamble looks like it's about to backfire. And Sheridan's brilliance is in forcing us to watch a man who built his whole identity on control spiral into total exposure. Let's start with the distillery again. Because that shiny new empire Dwight thought would save him is fast becoming the exact battlefield that could bury him. Dwight convinced himself bourbon was his ticket to legitimacy, a way to look like a businessman instead of a thug. But episode 3 makes it crystal clear that distillery is a powder keg. It's not just liquor, it's leverage. It's bait dangling in the water, drawing sharks from every corner. Jeremiah Dunmire didn't appear in this season by accident. The man is old money, old power. And he sees Dwight's bourbon move for what it really is, a challenge. Dwight thinks he's leveling up, but in Dunmire's world, Dwight's playing dress up with something he doesn't understand. And the trailer doesn't waste time hinting that Dunmire's patience is thin. He's not here to negotiate. He's here to erase. The danger with Dunmire is that he isn't sloppy. Sheridan crafted him to be the polar opposite of Dwight. Where Dwight is brash, Dunmire is calculated. Where Dwight thrives in chaos, Dunmire makes silence feel like a threat. Watching him glide into this story is like watching a man walk into a house fire with gasoline in his hands. He doesn't need to scream, doesn't need to flex. His entire vibe tells you Dwight's empire is already on borrowed time. And that's terrifying because Dwight can fight men like Walter Plowd, violent, impulsive. But a man like Dunmire? A man who doesn't swing until the exact right moment. Dwight doesn't know how to beat that. And the real horror is he probably won't realize it until it's already too late. Now let's shift to Dwight's so-called crew. Because if the distillery is the battlefield, his crew is the weak armor he's trying to strap on. And honestly, it looks like it's falling apart before the fight even starts. Bodhi's paranoia is practically dripping off the screen. The wide-eyed rookie who once thought Dwight was some legend worth following now looks like a man teetering on collapse. That shift is massive. Because in a world like Dwight's, once fear cracks open loyalty, there's no fixing it. Bodhi's on the edge of flipping and everyone knows it. Then there's Mitch, the quiet conscience of Dwight's empire, already worn out by the chaos. Mitch has always been loyal, but episode 3 makes it clear his patience isn't endless. And when you pile on Cleo, whose loyalty is tied to money more than blood, you realize Dwight's army isn't an army at all, it's a collection of opportunists, doubters, and defectors waiting for the right chance to slip out the door. That's the cruel twist Sheridan is dangling in front of us. Dwight walks around calling himself the general. But what kind of general leads an army already halfway gone? Loyalty was always the myth Dwight sold himself. But episode 3 shows us that myth unraveling in real time. The man demands loyalty but never trusts. He calls himself a protector, but Theo's ashes prove otherwise. And his crew? They're starting to see the writing on the wall. Dwight's empire doesn't just look shaky, it looks cursed. Stick with him long enough and you'll end up like Theo, torched in someone else's war. That kind of fear spreads faster than Dunmire's threats ever could. It spreads inside the camp, turning friends into suspects and soldiers into deserters. And that's where Dwight's paranoia turns fatal. The trailer doesn't hide it. Dwight's bark is louder, his temper shorter, his trust thinner than ever. He thinks suspicion keeps him strong, but in reality, it's corroding him from within. The cracks in his leadership aren't just small, they're seismic. And the irony is brutal. The man who built his myth on loyalty is now presiding over a crew that doesn't believe in him, doesn't trust him, and maybe doesn't even fear him anymore. The second that fear evaporates, Dwight stops being a king. He becomes just another old man in the way. But if the crew's fractures weren't enough, Let's talk about the weight of guilt Dwight's dragging into this episode. Theo's destruction isn't just another subplot, it's the smoking gun that Dwight can't escape. And Sheridan knows it. Dwight will never say it out loud. But episode 3 is written to show us what Dwight won't admit: Theo burned. Because Dwight made the wrong move. Because Dwight thought bourbon was a crown instead of a curse. And guilt like that doesn't just eat at a man, it warps his decisions. That's the tension humming under every frame of the trailer. Dwight trying to puff his chest and act like the general, while deep down he knows his allies are bleeding for his ego. That kind of guilt isn't weakness in Sheridan's world, it's gasoline waiting for a match. And the match is coming. What makes all of this so suspenseful is the setup Sheridan's building. The episode 3 teaser doesn't feel like a man walking into battle with weapons drawn. It feels like a man walking into an ambush with one arm tied behind his back. Musso pulling his leash. Dune Mire circling like a vulture. His crew cracking into pieces. Guilt weighing down every move. That's not a setup for victory, that's a setup for implosion. And Sheridan's cruel genius is that he wants us to watch the implosion in slow motion. He doesn't want Dwight to go out in a blaze of glory. He wants him to unravel, to break, to lose everything he pretends to control. And that's where the thrill comes in for us as the audience. We're not just watching a mob story anymore. We're watching a tragedy unfold. Dwight isn't the king, he's the cautionary tale. And episode 3 is promising to show us exactly how brutal that fall can look. Because let's face it, this isn't about whether Dwight survives. This is about how ugly Sheridan can make survival feel. And from the look of this teaser, survival is going to taste worse than defeat. By the time we hit this stretch of the episode, the feeling is undeniable: Dwight's kingdom is rotting from the inside out. What's wild is that Sheridan doesn't even have to show us explosions or shootouts to make it clear. The tension is in the details. It's in the way people talk to Dwight, the silences that hang too long, the way once loyal faces start shifting in the shadows. That's the brilliance of Tulsa King right now. The show has shifted from straight muscle to psychological warfare, and Dwight is losing both fronts. Episode 3 is shaping up to be the perfect middle punch of the season: ugly, suffocating, and designed to expose the very weaknesses Dwight has spent decades pretending don't exist. Let's break it down. Dwight always thrived on intimidation. That was his ace. He didn't need to outthink his enemies, he just had to outmuscle them, out them, outlast them. But what happens when intimidation stops working? What happens when the people around you aren't scared anymore, or worse, when they're more afraid of someone else than they are of you? That's what we're watching unfold in this episode. The authority Dwight used to command just by walking into a room now comes across as desperation. And that's a terrifying thing to watch in a man who once ruled his world. When the general starts yelling, and people don't jump anymore, that's when you know the collapse isn't coming, it's already here. Be in control. And the episode is setting him up for one of the nastiest downfalls we've seen on this show. The big question humming through every second is simple: who's really standing with Dwight? And who's just waiting for the right chance to turn? Loyalty was the whole myth Dwight sold himself on, but by episode 3, that myth is shredded. Bodhi is practically gone already, his fear outweighs any loyalty he ever had. Mitch is balancing on that razor's edge. And all it would take is one more chaotic Dwight decision to send him packing. And Cleo, she's looking at Dwight like a sinking ship she's ready to abandon. The crew that was supposed to be his backbone is fast becoming his biggest liability. And here's the chilling part: Dwight sees it. The paranoia on his face isn't subtle anymore. It's written in every barked order, every suspicion, every outburst. He knows the walls are caving in, and his answer isn't calm strategy, it's louder barking, harder suspicion, and desperate power plays. That's not a general's control. That's a drowning man splashing for air. Now let's not forget Musso. Sheridan makes sure to remind us that Dwight isn't running his own show anymore, not really. Musso's shadow stretches over everything, and episode 3 makes that leash feel tighter than ever. Dwight keeps trying to spin his bourbon empire as his way of proving he's not just Musso's puppet. But the more he talks about control, the clearer it becomes he has none. Musso is forcing Dwight into corners he doesn't want to be in, using favors, debts, and subtle threats like chess pieces. Dwight may not say it out loud, but you can see it in his face. Every move he makes now is under someone else's watch. That leash isn't coming off, and it's humiliating to watch a man who built his whole identity on control realize he's being puppeteered. The real sting is that Musso doesn't even have to raise his voice. The leash is invisible, but it's choking Dwight all the same. And then there's Demire, the silent executioner. If episode 3 has a real villain, it's him. Musso might hold the leash, but Demire is sharpening the blade. And the brilliance of Sheridan's writing is that Demire doesn't need to scream or fight to be terrifying. He just exists. He moves like a man who knows Dwight's already lost. Like the Bourbon Empire Dwight thought was his legacy is just a temporary amusement before it collapses. That's what makes Dunmire so chilling. He isn't fighting Dwight, he's erasing him. He doesn't want to prove a point, doesn't need to win a pissing contest. He wants Dwight's name, his empire, his whole presence wiped clean like he was never there. That's not just a threat, that's annihilation. And Dwight, for the first time, looks like he doesn't know how to fight it. He can't muscle his way past Dunmire. He can't intimidate him. He can't scare him off. He's staring down a predator who doesn't flinch. And that's when you know the king is standing on borrowed time. Now picture how this episode closes. Muso's leash wrapped tighter. Dunmire's shadow looming larger. Bodhi on the verge of flipping. Mitch and Cleo slipping further away. Dwight barking louder, getting sloppier, knowing deep down that every shout, every suspicion, every paranoid glance is proof that he's losing. Sheridan won't give us a neat ending here because that's not his style. He'll leave us dangling with the image of a man who thinks he's the king, standing in a crumbling kingdom that might already be gone. And the real suspense? Knowing that the fall isn't coming later, it's happening right now in slow motion. And episode 3 is just the beginning of the end. That's the genius of the season. It's not about Dwight pulling off some flashy win. It's about watching him implode, piece by piece, under the weight of his own pride and the enemies circling like vultures. Every second of episode 3 is building toward that implosion, daring us to watch a king turn into a pawn in real time. And the scariest part? Sheridan makes it feel inevitable. There's no miracle, no redemption, no last-minute trick that's going to save Dwight this time. The general has finally marched himself into a war he can't win. And episode 3 is the chapter where we all realize it.